Thank you guys for coming. Thank you so much for your interest, but especially thank Professor Falk for being willing to give a talk on a pretty tough time, a tough topic, a tough time. We didn't mean to time it quite like this, but anyway, we will take thoroughly advantage of your expertise. Let me just quickly introduce our speaker and let him take it away. Professor Falk did his undergraduate work at Carleton. Did his graduate work actually in medieval Renaissance studies. Did his graduate work at UCSD down the freeway, up the freeway. Did that in Middle East history, Jewish history, Islamic history. Spent a lot of the period from 2008 to 2019 living and working academically, professionally in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. So it really brings a lot of credibility to your talent. We were lucky enough to recruit him in 2019. Works in the history department here. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk. I've asked Professor Falk to try to keep it to about 45 minutes and then have a little time for a conversation. But you're the boss. So
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I've taught here since 2019, and in August, Professor Willoughby asked me to kind of give a follow-up on a short talk I gave in February as part of the Pearson Chambers Symposium. So things have changed since August for the worse, and they're worse now, and I just hope for a permanent ceasefire and just peace for the good of all in the region. And it's a pleasure to see so many current and former students here. I appreciate the support. I'm going to briefly talk about the future, but mostly about the past. Unlike political scientists, I can't predict the future and don't pretend to. But I want you to know how we got to this place, what power Hezbollah holds in Lebanon and in the region. Just briefly, if this is in fact the third Lebanon war, the first being the 1982 Israeli invasion, the second being in 2006, I think Hezbollah is likely to return to its strength, which is in the mountains of South Lebanon, hit and run, IED-type tactics, versus how they behaved in the Syrian civil war with the support of the Russian Air Force. With that said, what is Hezbollah? Are they a terrorist organization, a popular national resistance? Are they a charity? Are they a media empire? Are they a mercenary force for hire? Are they a drug cartel? Are they a political party? And I'll just say it depends on the time of the day, because they do all of those things. They kill civilians, they hire out their services for hire, they have popular support in the Shia communities of South Lebanon, and they do in fact deal drugs. Starting with marijuana in the 80s and moving on up to amphetamines since the Syrian civil war. So discussing sectarianism, I want to invoke two quotes. One from a Egyptian dissident journalist who passed away a couple years ago, Mohammed Haikal, talking about the Arab Spring and ultimately its failure. He says, "We in the Levant or Middle East are living on a past which does not know how to retreat and a future which does not know how to advance." And this kind of goes along with the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who says, "The crisis consists in the fact that the old is dying, but the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." That there are forces of change, but the old order will not retreat. Since Ibrahim brought memes this morning, I thought I would counter. So one view of sectarianism is the different sects of Lebanon have shared enemies at times and shared allies at others. For the Maronites, the Christian minority, they kind of dream of returning to Mother France and becoming a Mediterranean island rather than being part of the Middle East. In fact, this is a meme, the Leb exit, but this is serious, that after the 2020 port explosion in the Beirut port because of poorly stored ammonium nitrate, which is a fertilizer that can be turned into weapons. There were Lebanese legitimately asking to be colonized or have France assume control as they had between 1919 and 1946. So imagine saying our country shouldn't self-rule, we should be under the control of another country. So the strength of Hezbollah and the traditional political parties of Lebanon is the sectarian democracy that since the foundation of the country and its independence in the technical independence in the 1920s, actual independence in 1946, various seats of parliament are reserved for the then 17 different religious sects in the country. So if you want to vote for someone and they are not of your religion, tough luck. You can't vote for someone for their views. You can only vote for people in your religion. And we see this is the current cabinet. Anytime you put together a coalition government, you need to include members of the various sects in some sort of horse trading balance. And one critique, there was a kind of round of protests in 2019 and 2020. The economy was collapsing, but there are a lot of billionaires with, houses in Dubai. And people, the kind of classic Great Depression stuff, people can't take their own money out of the bank. And so someone went on Wikipedia and changed religious affiliation to irrelevant for all of the ministers in government. So I wanted to briefly show a protest song from there, kind of showing the disgust in the Arab world with the corruption of the ruling class. And they connect Lebanon with Iran, which is not Arab, of course, Iraq, and even Hong Kong, which has also had its protest movement at that time. So the idea that the guardians of sectarianism, that it's literally a patriarchal system because often a religious patriarch leads a political party. So the individuals, the grassroots, especially young people, are really disgusted with the abuses of the corrupt political class. And most of these people were born after the Lebanese Civil War, which ended in 1990. But after the Lebanese Civil War, all of the militia leaders returned to parliament. There wasn't a Truth and Reconciliation like in South Africa or any other kind of commission. So the war criminals are still in parliament and leading political parties. So this is in Lebanese dialect, kulun yani kulun. All of them means all of them. So rather than say down with Hezbollah, or down with the fascist phalange, younger people are saying down with sectarianism. Members of parliament, the ministers, and the business people and bankers that enable them. This is the Arabic word for revolution, thawra, being transposed onto the year 2019. This is some wordplay. Denouncing the various sectarian political parties. So, Biddi Allah billah hizbu. I want God but not his party, Hezbollah being the party of God. Hope but not the movement, another political party. Power, qawa billah qawat. Power but not forces, another political party, former militia. Nationalism but not Syrian nationalism, another political party. So this was kind of a movement against the political class that was kind of fostered in the 1970s, led the various militias in the 70s, 80s, and then haven't really gone away since then. So what does Hezbollah want? And this is why I think they didn't anticipate a wider conflict with Israel and didn't fully engage during the early days of the war in Gaza, is they wanted to show that they're strong and they are the resistance, but they want a president more than anything. As of Halloween, Lebanon will have been without a president for 2 whole years. And that is a period of immense challenges. The aftermath of the Beirut port explosion. There's a crisis that in a country of 5 million, there's 1 million Syrian refugees. There's hyperinflation, as I mentioned. Cost of living is going up, and things are even getting worse with this current conflict. So they're effectively adrift with only a caretaker government and no leader. And this is the second time this has happened. When I was doing my research in Lebanon, there was basically no president for the whole time I was there in a year and a half, almost 2 years. So why does that happen, and what does Hezbollah want? And it happens because there needs to be a quorum in parliament. In Lebanon, the president is elected by the parliament. If someone doesn't get an outright majority during the first round of voting, then it can just go to the person with the highest number of votes. So what Hezbollah and their allies do is they go to the first round of voting, and when their candidate doesn't win, they walk out. So there's no quorum, and Lebanon can't elect a president. This is the guy they want to be president, Souleymane Frangieh. Initially, he comes from a prominent Christian family. They claim descent from the Crusaders, believe it or not. During the Civil War, his father was initially allied with this guy, Samir Jaja. They're all Catholic. They're all Maronite. But his father refused the plan of creating a federal Christian Druze Muslim state in alliance with Israel. And so that led to a breakdown between one Christian militia and another Christian militia. And allegedly, Samir Jaja, the bald guy, he led a raid on Frangieh's family's house and killed his whole family. But now they still have to shake hands and make nice, because after the Lebanese Civil War, no victor, no vanquished. No war crimes tribunal, no truth and reconciliation. After that, I mean, they killed his baby sister. After that, he was sent abroad, saying, if they killed your family, you're not safe here. So he was raised in Syria in the Assad household. So he's been friends with Bashar al-Assad since they were teenagers. And so his party is very stridently pro-Syrian and allied with Hezbollah. And so that's why Hezbollah wants him elected president. As opposed to Jaja, who has taken himself out of the running for president, but he wants someone that is more pro-French, pro-US, and pro-Saudi. So it's kind of the Iranian Hezbollah candidate or the US, French, Saudi candidate. Believe it or not, Christians can be named jihad. That's the other bloc that's supported by the Lebanese forces, and Kataib and even the Druze support him. So these are the main candidates that are going in the presidential election. He's actually an independent who works for the International Monetary Fund until recently. So why would Hezbollah want a Christian elected president? Well, he's pro-Syria, so that makes one bit of sense. And that goes back to this sectarian democracy that reserves seats for different religious sects. And to do that, I have to move away from current events and political science and go back into history. 120 years before Hezbollah was founded. And that goes to this guy, Tanya Shaheen. The Shia in South Lebanon are kind of outside the picture right now because modern Lebanon is bigger than the mountain. In this time, there were two cantons. That there was a Maronite tax collector and a Druze tax collector. Druze being an offshoot of Shia Islam that recognized one caliph as kind of God or somehow godlike. So they're regarded as heretical by most mainstream Muslim sects. And his rebellion wasn't actually sectarian because he was a peasant, he was a Christian peasant rising up against a Christian landlord. So we can recognize that as a class conflict. However, these places weren't homogenous. So there were Christian peasants with Druze landlords. And so when the rebellion moved from the Maronite district to the Druze district, it took on a sectarian dimension. And it became a quote unquote, religious war. And when his main point was the rent is too damn high. He gets repurposed during the Civil War. You see him alongside Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, Patrice Lumumba, Druze leader Kamal Jumblat, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, the former Egyptian president. So he's kind of recognized as a proto-socialist in 1860. During that conflict, the Druze are scattered between what is now Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. There's a handful in Jordan. The foreign minister of Jordan is Druze, Ayman Safadi. So when Christians are rebelling, the Druze call their cousins. And they arrive on horseback and they brutally put down this Christian uprising. They slaughter about 10,000 Christians. And this gets the attention of Europe, especially when it spreads to Damascus. So there's kind of lingering resentment because the Ottoman Empire had recently passed a sort of Bill of Rights that gave Christians and Jews legal equality. So there was some resentment that Muslims were no longer top dog in an Islamic empire. Just as an aside about the Druze, the most famous Druze today are Amal Clooney, Casey Kasem, who passed away, if you remember him. He had hosted the countdown of the top 40, also was the voice of Shaggy on Scooby-Doo. His real name was Kamal Qasim, but he became Casey Kasem. And the former Minister of Oil and Vice President of Venezuela, Tariq al-Isami. So the violence spread and spread from Lebanon to Damascus. And this leads to what we can kind of consider the first human rights invasion. That today we can, a lot of military conflicts are justified by the defense of human rights or minority rights. But Europe in this time is very concerned about the crumbling Ottoman Empire, the plight of the Christians, but they're also interested in breaking up the Ottoman Empire to their benefit. One person who becomes a kind of international humanitarian celebrity is Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was an Algerian rebel who fought France for 20 years, is in exile in Damascus, and saves a lot of Christians by sheltering them in his palace. So he fought France for a long time and then receives the Légion d'honneur from France for his humanitarian efforts. It's 1861. And the US is also grateful. So Abe Lincoln sends him revolvers, and they're now in the Algerian Museum. There's even a town named El Kader, Iowa, named after him. That was from that time. So this is, getting coverage in European newspapers, and Britain and France are frenemies in the colonization of Africa and Asia. Russia is interested in the eastern parts of the Caucasus and the Orthodox places in the Balkans. So they all have an interest in not letting the other European powers totally, demolish the Ottoman Empire. So it's kind of propped up by their rivalry. And Napoleon III sends an invading force during his time during the Second French Empire. They arrive after the Ottomans have already kind of put down the violence, and the Ottomans act quickly because they don't want this to become another Algeria. They had lost Algeria to France 30 years earlier, so they want to show that they're in charge of things. And in order to make sure the French leave, the various powers, the Ottomans, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, agreed to a kind of constitution, an organic law. And that separates Mount Lebanon from the rest of the province of Beirut, makes sure the governor is Catholic but not Lebanese, because they don't want them to be locally popular. And they create a sectarian system that the council of 15 will be 8 Christians, 7 Muslim or Druze. Technically, it's 4 Maronites, 1 Greek Catholic, 2 Greek Orthodox, 1 Armenian Orthodox, 5 Sunnis, 1 Druze, and 1 Shia. So that's the foundation of Lebanese government that is preserved into independent Lebanon and indirectly leads to the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. So how do the Shia get into this if there's not that many Shia in Mount Lebanon? That is the declaration of Greater Lebanon. The Maronite patriarch, who is still influential and very xenophobic in Lebanese politics today, Ilyas Howeik, he works with France to develop education for Christians, and he wants an independent Lebanon, but not just Mount Lebanon. He says this country won't be viable if it doesn't have another port, Tripoli, and the peasant population of the south and the Bekaa Valley. Bekaa and the south have been the targets of those recent airstrikes. So he gets to present to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, whereas the French make sure that Syrians who want to keep Lebanon as part of Syria do not get to present at the Paris Peace Conference. As well as, they allow Amir Faisal, the kind of T.E. Lawrence's associate, to present, but not Palestinians who want to remain part of Syria. And so so this brings so it's designed to be a Christian state, but they've added a whole bunch of Sunni Muslims in the north and a whole bunch of Shia Muslims in the south. So it's supposed to be a Christian state, but probably the day it's created, it's at best 50-50. So this is kind of the original sin of Lebanon. And the French set about trying to divide and rule, that even parts of Syria are separated. They would create a Druze state, an Alawi state. We see they transpose the Lebanese cedar onto the French tricolor. So they basically say there will be 3 minority states, Alawis, Christians, and Druze, and 2 Sunni states, Aleppo and Damascus. The rest of them are reunited, but Lebanon stays separate. And Ilyas Howeik is right next to the general and French High Commissioner Gouraud during the declaration of Greater Lebanon. So it's seen as, he's kind of blessing this new country. Fast forward to the first Lebanese presidential election. Previously, they'd all been appointed as head of the mandate by the French, but this one is going to be an actual contested election. A merchant and scholar, Mohammed al-Jisr from Tripoli, he has a lot of relations with the Orthodox community in trade and such. Beshr al-Khouri, who wants independence now, and Emile Adé, who wants to stay part of France, more or less. He had actually had early contacts in the 1920s and 30s with the Zionist movement, with the idea of creating a minority federation of a Christian state, a Druze state, and a Jewish state. The Maronite patriarch, I think it's a different patriarch than Hoek, he's freaking out. He calls the French High Commissioner and says, the dang Maronites are going to split the vote, and the Christian state will have a Muslim president. So what do? Say, stop the count. And they appoint Charles de Bass, this guy. So they cancel the election, and in fact, 1932 is the last census Lebanon ever has. So they don't want to have the numbers that Christians are the minority, so they stop keeping track of who lives in the country. They negotiate independence in 1936. There's Khoury and Ade, but this is with the socialist government of Leon Blum in France. And he's losing popularity as, rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and he is in fact Jewish. And there are people on the French right who later joined the Vichy's that say better Hitler than Leon Blum during Hitler's rise. So despite the fact that he agrees to the treaty, the next government doesn't ratify it. So Lebanon stays under French control, and the Vichy's want to keep the colonies. They want to keep Vietnam, Africa, and Lebanon. And they lock up these independence activists, Bashar al-Khoury and Riyad al-Sulh. They're both from the elite, the Maronite elite and the Sunni elite. They're both in business. And they're imprisoned together in a castle, of all places, in mountainous Lebanon. And they make their handshake agreement that the Christians won't demand Western intervention. They won't demand permanent connections to France. And the Muslims won't demand to be unified with Syria. That's what's called the National Pact. Now, this is not a legal document. This is not in the Lebanese constitution. This is just a handshake agreement between two activists. And beyond the sectarian system, they start doling out different jobs. So this goes back to today, why Hezbollah wants Suleiman Frangieh to be president. The presidency is reserved for a Maronite Catholic. The prime minister is reserved for a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of parliament is reserved for a Shia Muslim. And the deputy speaker is an Orthodox Christian. They don't preserve the 8-to-7 ratio from 1861. Instead, it just becomes a 6-to-5 ratio. So for every 6 Christians in parliament, there will be 5 Muslims or Druze. So they preserve effectively Christian dominance in the top office and in parliament. And there are many Lebanese, I showed the meme of Lebanon floating away from the Middle East and becoming a Mediterranean island, who very much want to push away from any sort of Arab identity. Sayyid Aql, who ironically, he wrote poetry in Arabic, he attempts to change the alphabet of Lebanon to Latin letters to kind of separate from the Arab world. The next factor that shifts the demographics of Lebanon is the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and the Nakba. In that, about 100,000 Palestinians flee, especially from the north, to Lebanon, and again, showing the different treatment of different religious groups. Palestinian Christians get citizenship and have a pretty easy time assimilating. Palestinian Muslims don't get citizenship. So that changes. So there is now a large body of Palestinian Muslims in the camps in South and in South Beirut, who to this day, even if your grandfather was born in Lebanon, do not have citizenship and cannot work legally. And so they are kind of a permanent underclass there. A movement comes along led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, saying, the Europe has been able to weaken us through our division, and that we'll finally be stronger together by uniting all of the Arabic-speaking countries and others like Somalia into a unified Arab state. And he's smart enough to know that Lebanon should be off the table, because he knows Lebanon is probably a red line for France. But nevertheless, Lebanese Arabs, both on the left, the Arab nationalists and Palestinians, want union with Egypt and Syria, the United Arab Republic. And that prompts the first Lebanon crisis, the first of 2 times American Marines are present there. And these are the people who are disempowered, Palestinian refugees, Shia Muslims, Druze, and they're protesting that Maronites have all the power. And Camille Chamoun, he wants to have another term as president, and he wants to stay in power. What's happening in the 1950s in the world? How can the international community get involved? UN, Cold War. So Kamal Chamoun plays the Cold War card. He says, there are some leftists that don't want me to have power anymore. They must be communists. And under the Eisenhower Doctrine, the US sends troops and negotiates a situation where Chamoun doesn't stay in power, but they replace him with a general, that the Lebanese army is seen as neutral. And this is one of several times where a general becomes president in Lebanon. So I spent a lot of time talking about sectarianism. What about the Shia, and how does Hezbollah come about? And it starts in the same way as parts of the Iranian Revolution and other Shia movements in Iraq. It starts in seminaries. 3 major seminaries, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Iran. And the politically minded Shia are persecuted everywhere. That if you're quiet and don't criticize the government, you can, lead prayers and practice your religion. But as soon as you criticize the Arab nationalist government or the Ba'athist government in Iraq, or criticize the Shah of Iran, you're going to prison or you're going into exile. So these are groups of Lebanese, Iraqi, and Iranian students in the 1950s and 1960s, thinking of, how can we liberate ourselves from the corruption as well as secularism in the case of the Arab nationalists. And, Ayatollah Khomeini, the future leader of the Iranian Revolution, he comes up with a kind of novel interpretation of Islamic law called the guardianship of the judge, that says until the 12th Imam returns with the Messiah, government shouldn't be in the hands of any king or any other leader. It should be under the oversight of a judge. And this is the theory underpinning Iran's government, that there can be an elected president, but his policies can be vetoed and overridden by the supreme leader, now Ali Khamenei. The other thing about these, and I showed the Google Maps version because this is also a major Shia pilgrimage. So many people walk from Najaf to Karbala to the shrine of Imam Hussein, the Prophet's grandson. So imagine walking 15 hours with folks. You get a kind of spirit de corps. We're in this together, whether you're Lebanese or Iraqi or Iranian. And they also intermarry. So many of the major political families in Iraq, Lebanon, and Iranian Shias communities are intermarried to each other, like the Sadrs, Khomeinis, and Musawis. So it's somewhat ironic that, many people consider Hezbollah a terrorist organization, but the 2 main political groups that were empowered by the US after the overthrow of Saddam, they came from the same tradition. The Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Dawa Party, they were the US's main partners in Iraq after 2003. And then the Lebanese parties, Amal or Hope, and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah develops out of the Amal movement that was previously known as the movement of the dispossessed. So it speaks to their poverty and lack of development. And both Amal and later Hezbollah, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood in the Sunni world, they gain popularity by filling the gaps in the state. That if the poor aren't being served by the government, then Hezbollah or Amal can provide education. They can provide a health clinic. They can provide food subsidies. So they have that charitable function alongside their role as a political party and a militant group. And they kind of share this. Musa Sadr was likely murdered by Muammar Gaddafi at some point in the 1970s. It's never been revealed. So the PLO then arrives in Lebanon, which is another trigger of the war, the Israeli invasion, and the rise of Hezbollah. After being previously based in Jordan, they're seen as maybe more powerful than the Jordanian government. And they attempt to overthrow the conservative Jordanian government that doesn't want them to use Jordan as their base of operations in their war with Israel. And they think that Syria, as a fellow Arab nationalist state under the Ba'ath, will support them. And the Syrian army does, but the Syrian Air Force under Hafez al-Assad hates the PLO because he doesn't control them. And so this leads Jordan, with British support, being able to defeat the PLO, and they are forced to evacuate from Jordan to Lebanon. This is how the Lebanese civil war comes to involve the PLO. Because an odd group of Arab nationalists, leftists, the Shia poor under Amal, Arab nationalists like Nasser, and even communists form this odd coalition that is agreed on the fact that the Lebanese sectarian system isn't fair and they should abolish sectarianism. So Hezbollah isn't founded yet. They also make the mistaken assumption that Syria, as an Arab nationalist country, will support them. So when Syria gets the mandate to be the peacekeeper in Lebanon, they think they'll support them, but Syria wants to control Lebanon. It doesn't really want to help the leftists or Arab nationalists overthrow the government. So they are bitterly disappointed, and the Lebanese conflict kind of metastasizes. That it starts out as Christian versus Muslim, and then it turns into Christian versus Christian that I mentioned, Muslim versus Muslim, even Shia versus Shia, and Palestinian versus Palestinian. It starts out as generally straightforward and then goes from there as foreign powers, including France, the US, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, are all supporting different armed groups in a parallel to what happened during the Syrian civil war of the last decade. So Hezbollah comes about during the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. At first, they say they'll create a 25-mile buffer zone. Again, we see parallels with what's happening now. But they actually march on Beirut. And they force the election of Bashir Gemayel, a Christian from the fascist Phalange. It's the same name as Francisco Franco's political party, just in French. But he's assassinated, which leads to an orgy of violence. Even though he was killed by a Christian, his militia takes out their anger on the Palestinians, leading to the Sabra and Shatila massacre. So while the PLO, the armed organization of Palestinians, has evacuated to Tunisia, still, a whole lot of Palestinians remain and are targeted by Israel and the Christian militias. They realize that their dream of creating a Lebanese government in alliance with Israel is probably dead, so they withdraw to the south. And they create a puppet state called the Free Lebanon State. So this is Arafat claiming victory, leaving for Tunisia under the auspices of the US and France. This is the second time US Marines are deployed to Lebanon. So for a few years, they call it the Free Lebanon State. And then they do away with that legal fiction and just call it the South Lebanon Security Belt. And this is where Hezbollah makes its name as a Lebanese national resistance. While at first they kind of allude to creating a grand Islamic republic uniting Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, they eventually turn more local. They want Christian and Druze allies. So if you were here for Ibrahim's talk, talking about nationalist Islamists, saying we are Lebanese first and foremost, and we're here to defend Lebanon from occupation. And so they carry out kind of guerrilla attacks, hit and run, assassination, assassinating people who collaborate with Israel. And a lot of Lebanese resent the Israeli presence. So there are Christians who pass information to Hezbollah to facilitate their attacks, prison breaks, and it's kind of known that they tended to be more lenient on Christians than they were on other Muslims who collaborated, and even after the Israeli withdrawal in 2000. They were under the South Lebanon Army under Saad Haddad, mostly Melkite Greek Catholics and Maronite Catholics, a handful of Druze, and it's claimed that there were Shia in the militia, but I've never been able to identify people, but they probably aren't advertising their history in the SLA. And so the image of Khomeini is kind of the inspiration to Hezbollah, but I would push back against the idea of Hezbollah as exclusively an Iranian puppet. It's the fact that political parties, militias in Iraq, Hezbollah and Amal in Lebanon, and the Iranian clerics, they have a common history as a political movement coming out of those seminaries, and generally common security concerns or political concerns. Khomeini, he now has the axis of resistance because he was the arch villain. He was even in a Batman comic trying to recruit the Joker for his organization. This is happening at the same time as the Iran-Iraq war. So Hezbollah, when they refer to a soldier, a militant dying, they say he was martyred on the road to Jerusalem. And Khomeini said, okay, Israel is this great evil, but the road to Jerusalem passes through Karbala, saying we need to fight Iraq first, and then we can fight Israel. And I think we see the same Iranian reticence to directly, Iran isn't providing air cover for, they aren't intervening on Hezbollah's behalf because they don't want that war because they know, the US would get involved. So Hezbollah develops as an offshoot of Amal, and at first they're allied, but eventually those two Shia militias turn against each other in what's called the War of Brothers, because Amal is getting support from Syria, and Hezbollah is getting support from Iran. And so again, it's kind of the internationalization of the Lebanese civil war, that despite having generally common cause, they are proxies, that they are fighting on behalf of their sponsor. Iran, in its conflict with Israel, will fight to the last Lebanese. I once had a Saudi student tell me that, if Saudi goes to war with Iran, Saudi Arabia will fight to the last Pakistani. Because so many of their military are recruited from other Muslim countries. I think they even have Colombian mercenaries in their military. This is a young Hassan Nasrallah. After the assassination of Abbas Moussawi and the kind of retirement of the other co-founder, Subia Tufaili, who's kind of very critical, he's still alive, he's critical of Hezbollah. Nasrallah becomes the leader in 1991. He's actually more charismatic than those who preceded him, and so his speeches, that are kind of smuggled around on tapes, become very well known. So these organizations are local, but draw from a common inspiration. So there's not only Lebanese Hezbollah, but since the 2010s, there's Iraqi Hezbollah. Then there were attempts to foster an organization that mostly died out in the Shia eastern province of Saudi Arabia. So Hezbollah in the Arabian Peninsula or Hezbollah in the Hejaz. And they frequently use the image of the Dome of the Rock. And if you go to South Lebanon, they even have created a replica Dome of the Rock there. And they come to international attention by not in the first phase of the Civil War, but by demanding the withdrawal of foreign forces. And they include Israeli, American, French, and although they now are allied with Syria, even Syrian forces. So this is how they kind of make their name as a national religious organization, by bombing the Marine barracks. And sure enough, they managed to get the US to leave. So their two huge political victories are forcing the withdrawal of the multinational force in 1982-83, and then forcing the withdrawal of Israeli forces in 2000, because that shows them as defending Lebanon from outside occupation. Their reputation shifts when it seems like they are drawing Lebanon into conflict. So they're a Shia party. You have to be Shia to join, but they are very much concerned with their reputation among Christians, Druze, and Sunnis in Lebanon. As I mentioned, today they are allies, but during the war they actually did briefly fight against each other. And they embrace the idea of martyrdom, that recruiting, like Hamas does, from underprivileged youth that have no hope for a career, probably don't have hope for a better life. You can find meaning in self-sacrifice. So this figure is called, his name is Bilal, but the title is Groom of the South. That he won't grow up to marry, but he's married to South Lebanon in his death, in his suicide. We're going a little short on time, but I wanted to play a song. We were just watching Waltz with Beirut in one of my classes, and an Israeli artist adapted it to a cake song from the 90s, and this is a movement in Israel to withdraw from Lebanon. And so he's singing it from the kind of blasé position of an American during the Vietnam War. They're thinking about the American experience of the Vietnam War rather than the Vietnamese experience. But you can kind of put yourself in the opposite position. And I've heard this has gotten popular again, but they're missing the point of it. In the same way that if you know the Creedence Clearwater song, Fortunate Son, it's an anti-war song, but people think it's a pro-USA patriotism song. So I'll show a brief clip of this. Stop there. Every day at the pull of a trigger, we finished off people we didn't even know. And as we talked about in my class, the phenomenon of shooting and crying. Think of the regrets of the soldier rather than the victim of war. In 2000, Ehud Barak withdraws from Lebanon. In a similar way to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the US thought the Afghan army would stand up for at least a while, but they were corrupt and they collapsed more quickly than anticipated. So Israel withdraws and the South Lebanon army swiftly collapses, and they rush the border with Israel. And Israel eventually takes a few thousand of them. They are basically shunned by Palestinian citizens of Israel, and so they actually are moved into the Jewish schools rather than the Palestinian schools in Arabic. So apparently there's heritage Arabic still spoken by them, but people who are younger text Arabic in Hebrew letters, their descendants in Israel today. And this is a huge win for Amal and Hezbollah, that every time Israel had withdrawn previously from the Sinai or in other peace agreements, they did that with a peace treaty and recognition. But Hezbollah and Amal made Israel withdraw without recognition and without a peace treaty. And they swiftly demolished the statue of Saad Haddad, the leader of the South Lebanon army. So instead of the flag of Israel flying alongside the flag of Lebanon, now if you go to the south, you can see destroyed Israeli tanks with Hezbollah and the Lebanese flag together. I'll just briefly touch on the Syrian civil war. As the Assad government was about to fall to the rebels, they were rescued by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Russian Air Force, and Hezbollah. And this is when Hezbollah becomes more of a formal army. I don't think they're ideologically attached to Assad's government, but this is how they get arms, by transiting them from Iran through Iraq, through Syria. So it was about protecting that route as much as it was, saving the Assad government. And this hurts their reputation among Sunnis because they commit war crimes against Sunni populations in Syria, because they're pretty brutal in terms of reprisals, no matter whether it was a secular Free Syrian Army or jihadist or ISIS. They're absolutely brutal. But it improves their reputation among Christians and Druze, because some of the more extreme factions in the Syrian civil war said, Christians to Beirut, Alawis to the grave. That Alawis and Druze aren't real Muslims, so we're going to kill them, and we're going to exile the Christians to Lebanon. And just going off the term, they were martyred on the road to Jerusalem. A Syrian friend of mine says, oh, they killed a lot of Muslims on the road to Jerusalem. That their actions in the Syrian civil war, they were more interested in strengthening their organization and its armaments than they were in, quote unquote, liberating Jerusalem. And this is, so I took this picture at a sandwich shop in Damascus in 2008. They also clear out, while I was living there, ISIS or al-Nusra attempted to take over a village near the border. And so, they do cooperate with the Lebanese military. So again, this improves their reputation among Lebanese, that they are protecting Lebanon from a foreign occupation, and they work on both sides of the border. And they create very weird propaganda showing Shia Christian synergy, showing Jesus and the Imam Ali, like that. And they even create an associate militia supporting, so they to be in Hezbollah, you have to be Shia, but then they create the Lebanese resistance brigades that recruit from Christians, Sunnis, and Druze as well. I'll skip over the drug trade, but they get their president elected in 2016. He leaves office in 2022, and it's been vacant since then. And so they don't have the votes for president, but they have the guns, and they're going to get their way no matter how long it takes. So ultimately, if I have a message today, it's that they will be powerful and have influence as long as the sectarian system remains. That is what empowers a corrupt elite of any religion. And I'll end with a quote by the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran. Pity the nation divided into fragments, each fragment deeming itself a nation. that they aren't a shared country. They are a patchwork of different countries that don't see a common identity together. So that is my talk. Thank you.
Is there time for conversation? I'll let you field the questions.
Questions? Yeah.
I had a question. While you were there, would you say that your time witnessing like the youth that they experienced the same radicalism as their predecessors, or was there the same to what they had seen?
In terms of like sectarianism, I would say it varied. I think a lot more, liberal people hate sectarianism and view it as, why can't the trash get picked up? It's because sectarian politics are, it's like kind of like the mafia, no-show jobs, that sort of thing. That the state is failing because of patronage, that you need to be in good with the party in order to do anything in the country, and so it's not a meritocracy. On the other hand, there are still very partisan, bigoted people. I come from St. Louis, Missouri, and Lebanon is a whole other level of racism. I speak decent Arabic and very bad French. In East Beirut, sometimes people would be nicer to me if I spoke bad French versus decent Arabic, because I don't have a Lebanese accent. I kind of have a mixture of, I worked with Syrian and Iraqis, so I've got kind of a mixture accent. And so there are, many Christians. I heard an older Christian woman say, the PLO left in 1982. I wish Israel had sent all of the Palestinians with them. So it's like, because I'm an American, they think that I would agree with that idea. So there's still sectarianism, there still is extremism, but there's also a lot of people who are just fed up with the failure of their parents' generation.
During your speech, did you say you pushed back on the idea of Hezbollah being an Iranian puppet? Why would you say that the majority of their funding is coming from Israel?
I think it's one thing to have their interests align and accept that support. It's another thing to say they are exclusively just taking orders from them. I think Iran would, as I said, Iran will fight to the last Lebanese. They would prefer Hezbollah to be more aggressive and kind of fight their battles for them. But Hezbollah is playing the political game in Lebanon. So it's not kind of blindly taking directives from Iran. It is interested in its own political and social future locally. Yeah, I mean, I think they would evolve, but they would remain. I mean, I think one estimate on their funding would like turn out to be like 15% of Iran's GDP. So I don't think it's as high as it's reported some places. But they do have local support, and they had support before they were getting Iranian weapons later on. So yeah, I think they would evolve, but they would still have a reputation and popularity. They would probably again have IEDs and hit and runs with Kalashnikovs. They wouldn't have rockets. I think that would be the transformation. Mm-hmm.
You said that as long as the sectarian system remains, that Hezbollah will maintain power, but you also mentioned that they are the reason why a president doesn't get elected, because they're causing this sort of gridlock in that system. So how do you see Lebanon getting out of this? Like, if that's the current predicament, what possible solution exists?
I mean, really a new constitution where you can vote for your best candidate rather than being forced into voting only on people of your religion. And so it's like they need a new constitution. But the slogan of the end of the Civil War was "No victor, no vanquished." And so, all the political leaders were former militia leaders. And so they can use their patronage to keep loyalty within their sect, and then strategically collaborate when it suits their purposes. But they basically are using their weapons as a veto, because all the other militias disarmed at the end of the civil war, but because of the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, they were allowed to keep their weapons with pressure from Syria and Iran. And so, I think this is perhaps a scary future if the United States, if one political party has all the weapons and the other one doesn't, can you effectively use that as a veto if your chosen president doesn't win the election? Yeah, I think you're right that the conflict is their reason for existing. Um, so I think kind of going back to your question, they would transform back into a religious charity political project. But they know they're not defeating Israel, but they need to show their grassroots supporters that they're trying. That I think they are political realists. So that's why they didn't invade northern Israel during the ongoing destruction of Gaza. But they need to show that they're doing something to their supporters. And so that's why they tried to kind of balance this fine line of hitting military sites, but not civilian sites. But that in the last couple weeks has gone out the window. First, a few months ago, they hit a Druze village, which also cost them support among Druze in Lebanon. And now, as the conflict is widened, now they're not just hitting military sites, but also civilian ones in Israel. Because they thought that would maybe shield their civilians from the blowback. That in the last decade, Israel has usually struck Hezbollah at military sites in Syria rather than in Shia communities in Lebanon, and that's not happening. So the idea of military versus military, it's now civilians are involved.
From what I heard, Iran and Hezbollah, they don't want a regional war, but they have to defend, themselves. But that seems like they're walking like a fine line. Like we're going to defend ourselves, but we're not going to, because then that'll bring in
Yeah, the U.S.
the U.S. So is it just like a holding until the election?
Yeah, I think that sadly is part of it. I think there's a few reasons why Israel is escalating with Lebanon. Netanyahu, it's not only his political career, but that's part of it. That it was a massive. October 7th was a massive intelligence failure on the part of the Israeli intelligence. It was a massive military failure on the part of the IDF. So I think those organizations are trying to reestablish their reputation as the top military force in the Middle East. And if they can draw Iran and Hezbollah into less than deadly confrontations and improve their support from the US, they'll do that. That I think Hezbollah has maybe killed 100 or 200 Israelis in the last year. I think Iran has killed 1 Palestinian and 2 Jordanians in all of these rocket barrages. So it's like they're trying to show they're doing something without bringing the US in. But the IDF, I think, wants to, before this is over, reestablish its reputation. Yeah, Shukriya. Yeah, I mean, I understand your point that like what check has the Biden administration been on the Israeli military? I think it would be an entirely blank check if Trump wins the election. Um, Whereas, I think at least European and Latin American public opinion has shifted. A lot of Israelis compare it to 9/11, and I see the parallels that the U.S. had universal sympathy on 9/12 and lost that over the next decades. That people, no matter your politics on Israel-Palestine, you felt sympathy for civilian death. And the year of war in Gaza and the destruction of Gaza and all of these civilian casualties, they realized that global public opinion has turned. And I think even some parts of the Democratic Party and maybe the Harris campaign realizes that too, and maybe would be stronger in her withholding of. I mean, I think recently Ireland and France said they are stopping arms exports. Would the U.S. stop arms exports? If it's shown that there was use of white phosphorus in Lebanon or other intentional targeting of civilians, which seems likely in South Beirut, which is home to a lot of Hezbollah supporters that are civilians. Yeah. That I don't think the previous Trump administration really served up whatever Netanyahu wanted on a platter. They, previously the idea was the U.S. embassy would be in Tel Aviv, and then maybe if the two-state solution was realized, then the U.S. would move the embassy to Jerusalem, which it regards as its capital. They created Trump's deal of the century for a two-state solution. Was done without consultation with any Palestinians. It was kind of a discussion between the Saudi crown prince, Jared Kushner, and the Netanyahu government. So, any sense of balance would be kind of gone. And, the Trump administration closed the American consulate in East Jerusalem and Ramallah as well. So I think, previously support for Israel had been pretty bipartisan. I think it was under the Obama administration that Netanyahu kind of made a deal that he will support Republicans and try to undermine Democrats, and rather than previously Israel had kind of cultivated relationships with both parties.
You mentioned that Hezbollah did such a favor to Assad during the Syrian civil war. Is Assad returning the favor? I mean, it seems like you don't see anything about Syrian participation. They're just ducking and covering? Or?
Yeah, and they don't respond when Israel hits sites, when they hit the Iranian consulate, when they kill Syrian soldiers, when they hit a Russian airbase recently. Assad's father effectively accepted Israel in 1996. And they know militarily they're not going to get back the Golan Heights. And so they're staying out of it. We can kind of see Syria, it's partially occupied by Turkey and the US in association with a communist militia. But the Syrian government we can view as a condominium between Russia and Iran. Russia for its interests, and Russia for a warm weather port and an air base. Iran for both ideological and military missions, and they are entirely dependent on that support because their economy has been crushed. So they're not going to strike back. Mm-hmm.
BDS movement, like the boycott, and I guess for a long time the Arab countries didn't trade with Israel,
Mm-hmm.
but then I think UAE and
Bahrain and yeah.
and they, now that Israel has that natural gas,
Mm-hmm.
now they're selling it to like Egypt and to they're gonna think that, like, why are they, the Arab countries still trading with?
Yeah, and recently, it was shown that there was an Israeli airstrike on the Houthis in Yemen. The Israeli plane refueled over Saudi Arabia. So when the Emirates normalized relations with Israel and under the Abraham Accords in 2019, Saudi Arabia wasn't part of that, but they opened their airspace and allowed ground travel. So you can ship things in a truck from Israel through Jordan, through Saudi Arabia to the Emirates. And I'll paraphrase, I think this is a quote from Mohammed bin Salman talking to Anthony Blinken. He said, I don't care about the Palestinians, but my people do. So he was ready to go full speed ahead with normalization and still probably wants to, in exchange for Israeli tech, a civilian nuclear program, and a alliance, a formal alliance with the U.S. So, you know, it's kind of crocodile tears among the Gulf states and Egypt for Palestinians, unfortunately.
I keep checking my cell phone. I'll make sure we're on time, but I'm also keeping it distant because it's not a pager. But how did Israeli intelligence manage that operation? I mean, did Hezbollah totally drop the ball on shopping at Amazon in Tel Aviv?
Well, what they did, I made this joke in my class that I'm in my late 30s, so I'm statistically speaking like the youngest person who didn't deal drugs to have used pagers regularly. But Hezbollah said throw away your cell phones because they're getting hacked. Because there's an Israeli company called the NSO Group, and they have a software called Pegasus that is used by the Emirates. Morocco normalized, and it became clear that Morocco was using that software to spy on people. Egypt is using that spyware to spy on a presidential candidate. So they said, throw away your phones, use pagers, use word of mouth, because they thought that those things wouldn't be tracked in the way that, you know, you can have GPS tracking, you can have spyware, etc. So they decided to go back to the 90s with pagers, and Israel figured that out and interrupted the supply chain. I believe it was a Taiwanese model manufactured in Hungary or Bulgaria, and I think, yeah, that is how, and perhaps that company was set up in the last year in order to accomplish that. But yeah, it was they thought they were going low tech and that would make them safer, but instead it led to people being killed and blinded, etc.
If you don't mind, we'll continue to communicate on email.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's give a round of applause to the speaker.
Thank you.
We've learned so much. Really, really appreciate your lecture, and we'll stay in touch with you.
Yeah, of course, and please take my classes in the future.